The year was 2135, and the skies above Earth were ruled by colossal floating airships. These behemoths weren't just transportation, they were symbols of power. Kara stepped aboard one such airship, a sleek, futuristic vessel that glided silently through the clouds. It was a high-tech flight bound for the distant planet of Nova Prime, a place where only the elite and powerful traveled. Kara, however, wasn't one of those elites. She was a woman of mystery, her movements calm, her gaze steady. As she walked down the luxurious aisle of the airship, passengers turned their heads, their eyes lingering on her, but none dared to say a word. She wasn't like them. She didn't belong here, and they could sense it. Kara didn't care. She had learned long ago to ignore the stares. As a child, she had been taught to hold her head high, to be unshaken in the face of judgment. But today was different. This flight, this moment, felt like the beginning of something she couldn't yet understand. She didn't know it yet, but the tension in the air was about to escalate in ways no one could have predicted. As Kara took her seat in the VIP section, her presence seemed to create a ripple of discomfort. The cabin was filled with wealthy businessmen, powerful executives, and high-ranking officials, all of them accustomed to their privileged lives in the clouds. But there was something about Kara that unsettled them. Her black skin, her quiet confidence, and the aura of calm that surrounded her seemed to challenge everything they believed. Peter, a man in his mid-40s with a sharp suit and an even sharper glare, watched from a distance. His eyes narrowed as he saw Kara settle into the plush seat in the VIP section. He didn't like it. "What is she doing in first class?" Peter muttered under his breath, just loud enough for his companion to hear. He wasn't trying to be subtle. His disdain for Kara was clear, and he made no attempt to hide it. His companion, a woman who appeared to be in her early 30s, looked over at Kara and then back at Peter. "Probably a mistake," she said, her voice dripping with superiority. "She doesn't belong there." Peter snorted in agreement. His wealth and influence had carried him to the highest echelons of society, and he had grown accustomed to being around people who looked like him, people with power. He believed that people like Kara had no place among the elite. Around them, a quiet murmur began to spread. The other passengers, some already settling into their seats, had noticed the exchange. They looked at Kara, then at each other, their discomfort palpable. A few murmurs floated through the air, subtle but unmistakable. "That woman doesn't belong in first class," one of the passengers whispered to their neighbor. Another passenger, a man with a clipboard, overheard the conversation and nodded in agreement. "I didn't think they let people like her into the VIP sections anymore." It was a low, bitter remark that was meant to be heard but not challenged. Kara, however, didn't react. She remained calm, her fingers tightening around the armrests of her seat. She was used to this, used to the whispers, the judgment. The sting of racism was something she had endured for years, but it never stopped her. She had learned to walk through life with her head held high, to not let the world define her. The air around her seemed to grow colder, the atmosphere thick with hostility. Yet, there was a strange serenity about Kara. As the flight attendants began their safety demonstrations and the engines hummed to life, she simply stared out the window, her eyes fixed on the distant stars that awaited them. Meanwhile, Peter continued to stew in his irritation. His gaze never left Kara as he watched her, trying to make sense of the situation. "She's just here for the free ride," he muttered, his voice filled with disgust, trying to act like she belongs. Peter shifted in his seat, clearly bothered. He couldn't fathom how someone like her could end up in a place like this. A place where only the richest, most important people had the privilege to sit. He hated the idea of her presence, the way it seemed to challenge everything he stood for. As the ship began its ascent, the ground below shrinking into a distant memory, Kara remained perfectly still, her eyes never leaving the window. She knew what people thought of her. She had known it her entire life. But this flight, this journey, was more than just a simple trip. She wasn't just a passenger. Kara's grip on her seat tightened as the ship cut through the atmosphere. She wasn't afraid of what might happen on this flight. No, she was prepared. She had learned long ago how to keep her composure when others tried to break her down. But she couldn't shake the feeling that today, something was going to change. Something was going to happen that would make all these people realize they had underestimated her. The murmurs from the passengers died down as the ship's autopilot took over, and the crew began serving drinks. But the tension remained thick and heavy in the air. Kara had no idea how right she was. The airship had reached cruising altitude. The hum of the engines was almost soothing, but the unease among the passengers hadn't disappeared. There was a quiet but palpable tension, like a storm waiting to break. Kara sat, still and composed, her gaze fixed on the stars outside the window. She was used to the judgment, the whispers that followed her wherever she went. But this time, she felt something different, a shift in the atmosphere, a growing sense that her journey might not be as uneventful as she had hoped. Peter, who had been watching her since she boarded, couldn't contain his irritation anymore. The calm, composed way Kara sat in her seat made him feel unsettled. He couldn't stand the idea that someone like her might belong in the VIP section, let alone fly among people of his caliber. To him, her presence here was an insult. He leaned toward his companion, a woman with sharp features and a perfect smile. "She's still sitting there, isn't she?" Peter said, his voice low but filled with venom. "How does someone like her think she belongs in first class? It's a joke." The woman, who had been sipping her champagne with a slight smirk, glanced over at Kara, her lips curled into a disdainful smile. "She must have made a mistake, or maybe someone made a mistake letting her in," she said. "These people don't get to fly with us. We worked for this. They should know their place." Peter nodded, his fingers tapping impatiently on the armrest. He couldn't stand the thought of someone like Kara sitting comfortably in a space that was supposed to be reserved for people like him. People who had worked hard for everything they had. "She doesn't belong here, and I'm going to make sure everyone knows it," he muttered, barely audible. Kara felt the sting of their words. Even though they didn't speak directly to her, she had long stopped expecting kindness from others. The world had taught her that long ago. Still, it was hard to ignore the weight of the hatred, but she didn't let it show. She remained perfectly still, her hands folded in her lap, her breathing slow and steady. She had dealt with worse than this. As the flight attendants passed through the aisles, offering drinks and snacks, Peter stood up, his eyes fixed on Kara. He walked past the attendants, making his way toward her seat. He didn't look at anyone else as he moved. His steps were purposeful, almost predatory. The other passengers watched curiously, their gazes flickering between Peter and Kara. There was an eerie silence as Peter stopped next to her seat. "Excuse me, ma'am," he said, his voice dripping with condescension. "I believe there's been a mistake. You're sitting in first class, but I don't think this section is for people like you. I suggest you move to the back." Kara didn't look at him immediately. She continued staring out the window, as if she hadn't heard him. The air seemed to grow colder, the hum of the ship more distant. Peter took her silence as submission. He sneered. "Didn't you hear me? You don't belong here." He leaned down slightly, trying to make himself even more imposing. "I suggest you move before things get more uncomfortable." The passengers around them began to whisper again. Some exchanged uneasy glances, while others looked away, pretending they didn't see what was happening. No one dared to speak up, though. It wasn't their fight. But Kara, without looking at Peter, slowly turned her head toward him. Her eyes locked onto his with a calm intensity that made his words falter in his throat. For a moment, there was nothing but silence. Then, in a voice so calm it almost seemed unnerving, she said, "You've misunderstood, Mr. Calloway." Peter blinked, taken aback by her sudden attention. "What?" Kara's gaze never left him. "You think I don't belong here, but I'm not the one who doesn't belong." Peter opened his mouth, ready to snap back, but Kara cut him off, her words sharp and cold. "My name is Kara Winters," she said, her voice now louder for everyone to hear. "I am a senior agent with the Galactic Intelligence Agency, and you are currently standing in front of someone who could have you removed from this ship with a single command. So before you continue, I suggest you reconsider your attitude." Kara's grip on her seat tightened as the ship cut through the atmosphere. She wasn't afraid of what might happen on this flight. No, she was prepared. She had learned long ago how to keep her composure when others tried to break her down. But she couldn't shake the feeling that today, something was going to change. Something was going to happen that would make all these people realize they had underestimated her. The murmurs from the passengers died down as the ship's autopilot took over, and the crew began serving drinks. But the tension remained thick and heavy in the air. Kara had no idea how right she was. The airship had reached cruising altitude. The hum of the engines was almost soothing, but the unease among the passengers hadn't disappeared. There was a quiet but palpable tension, like a storm waiting to break. Kara sat, still and composed, her gaze fixed on the stars outside the window. She was used to the judgment, the whispers that followed her wherever she went. But this time, she felt something different, a shift in the atmosphere, a growing sense that her journey might not be as uneventful as she had hoped. Peter, who had been watching her since she boarded, couldn't contain his irritation anymore. The calm, composed way Kara sat in her seat made him feel unsettled. He couldn't stand the idea that someone like her might belong in the VIP section, let alone fly among people of his caliber. To him, her presence here was an insult. He leaned toward his companion, a woman with sharp features and a perfect smile. "She's still sitting there, isn't she?" Peter said, his voice low but filled with venom. "How does someone like her think she belongs in first class? It's a joke." The woman, who had been sipping her champagne with a slight smirk, glanced over at Kara. Her lips curled into a disdainful smile. "She must have made a mistake, or maybe someone made a mistake letting her in," she said. "These people don't get to fly with us. We worked for this. They should know their place." Peter nodded, his fingers tapping impatiently on the armrest. He couldn't stand the thought of someone like Kara sitting comfortably in a space that was supposed to be reserved for people like him. People who had worked hard for everything they had. "She doesn't belong here, and I'm going to make sure everyone knows it," he muttered, barely audible. Kara felt the sting of their words, even though they didn't speak directly to her. She had long stopped expecting kindness from others. The world had taught her that long ago. Still, it was hard to ignore the weight of the hatred, but she didn't let it show. She remained perfectly still, her hands folded in her lap, her breathing slow and steady. She had dealt with worse than this. As the flight attendants passed through the aisles, offering drinks and snacks, Peter stood up, his eyes fixed on Kara. He walked past the attendants, making his way toward her seat. He didn't look at anyone else as he moved. His steps were purposeful, almost predatory. The other passengers watched curiously, their gazes flickering between Peter and Kara. There was an eerie silence as Peter stopped next to her seat. "Excuse me, ma'am," he said, his voice dripping with condescension. "I believe there's been a mistake. You're sitting in first class, but I don't think this section is for people like you. I suggest you move to the back." Kara didn't look at him immediately. She continued staring out the window, as if she hadn't heard him. The air seemed to grow colder, the hum of the ship more distant. Peter took her silence as submission. He sneered. "Didn't you hear me? You don't belong here." He leaned down slightly, trying to make himself even more imposing. "I suggest you move before things get more uncomfortable." The passengers around them began to whisper again. Some exchanged uneasy glances, while others looked away, pretending they didn't see what was happening. No one dared to speak up, though. It wasn't their fight. But Kara, without looking at Peter, slowly turned her head toward him. Her eyes locked onto his with a calm intensity that made his words falter in his throat. For a moment, there was nothing but silence. Then, in a voice so calm, it almost seemed unnerving, she said, "You've misunderstood, Mr. Calloway." Peter blinked, taken aback by her sudden attention. "What?" Kara's gaze never left him. "You think I don't belong here, but I'm not the one who doesn't belong." Peter opened his mouth, ready to snap back, but Kara cut him off, her words sharp and cold. "My name is Kara Winters," she said, her voice now louder for everyone to hear. "I am a senior agent with the Galactic Intelligence Agency, and you are currently standing in front of someone who could have you removed from this ship with a single command. So before you continue, I suggest you reconsider your attitude." A ripple of shock spread through the cabin. Peter froze. His face went pale as he processed her words. The woman sitting in front of him, the one he had been so quick to belittle, was someone far more powerful than he had imagined. His mind raced. The Galactic Intelligence Agency was the most feared organization in the galaxy, tasked with keeping the peace across planets and star systems. Kara wasn't just some random passenger, she was a high-ranking official. Peter's eyes darted around the cabin, but it was clear that no one else was offering him any support. The whispers had stopped, and all eyes were on him now. His mouth went dry, and he found it hard to swallow. "Gelu, wait, you're a..." Peter stammered. Kara smiled, but it wasn't a kind smile. It was a smile that sent a chill down his spine. "I think we understand each other now, don't we, Mr. Calloway?" she said, her voice low but firm. "I'm not here to make your life harder, but if you keep pushing, I will make sure you regret it." For a moment, the airship felt like it was suspended in time. The entire cabin waited in tense silence, waiting for Peter's next move. Peter stood there, a mix of shock and embarrassment plastered across his face. His mouth opened and closed, but no words came out. All the confidence, all the arrogance he had walked onto this ship with, vanished in an instant. Kara returned her gaze to the window, as if she had said everything she needed to say. The tension in the air lingered, but now, it was different. The silence was no longer oppressive. It was filled with the realization that this woman was not someone to be messed with. The passengers slowly resumed their conversations, but the mood had shifted. Kara had shown them exactly who she was, and in that moment, Peter knew he would never forget this encounter. As the flight entered deep space, the dim glow of the stars cast a soft, eerie light over the passengers. The hum of the engines provided a constant backdrop to the quiet, tense atmosphere in the cabin. The flight attendants moved quickly, trying to keep things normal, but it was clear that everyone was aware of the tension between Kara and Peter. Kara, however, was completely unaffected. Her eyes remained closed, her expression calm as she relaxed in her seat. Despite the drama unfolding around her, she had a job to do, and nothing, not even a foolish businessman, was going to derail it. Peter, on the other hand, could feel the weight of every eye in the cabin on him. His pride had taken a serious hit, and now, he was trying to save face. He sat back down, but the anger was still bubbling inside him. He couldn't understand it. He was a powerful businessman, the son of one of the wealthiest families in the galaxy. He had everything: status, connections, and money. Yet here was a woman of color, who had barely spoken 2 words to him, and she had reduced him to nothing. He could feel the sting of her calm, her control, and it grated at his very soul. His hands clenched into fists, but he wasn't sure what to do next. His pride wouldn't let him back down, but he also knew that challenging Kara further could have dangerous consequences. What could she possibly do to him? And why did it feel like there was so much more to her than just her profession as a passenger on this flight? Suddenly, Peter's thoughts were interrupted by a loud beep, followed by an announcement from the flight captain. "Attention all passengers," the captain's voice echoed through the cabin. "We are approaching a restricted zone. Please stay seated with your seatbelts fastened. There will be a brief security inspection." The words were clear, but the tone was different. Peter's eyes flicked to Kara, who hadn't moved a muscle. The announcement seemed to pass over her like a whisper, but to Peter, it felt like something important was about to happen. Seconds later, the flight attendants began moving through the aisles with a heightened sense of urgency. But what struck Peter the most was the way they looked at Kara. There was no longer any of the forced politeness or neutrality from earlier. No, now the flight attendants were acting with a sort of reverence, almost as if they were afraid of her. Peter leaned over to his companion, his voice low and shaking. "What's going on? Why do they all treat her like that? She's just another passenger." His companion, clearly uncomfortable, glanced at Kara and then back at Peter. "I don't know, man, but I've seen those flight attendants act like that before. When a high-level VIP is on board, the staff doesn't treat them the same. They seem, well, afraid of her." Peter's brow furrowed. What did that mean? He stood up, the impulse to confront Kara once again taking hold of him. He was getting frustrated. He couldn't understand why everyone was acting like she was above him. With a hard look on his face, he moved to approach her seat. But just as he was about to take a step forward, The cabin door to the cockpit opened, and a flight attendant stepped out. This time, she wasn't moving with the usual calm efficiency. No, this time, she was visibly tense, even nervous. She stopped short when she saw Peter standing in the aisle, and her gaze flickered nervously toward Kara. "Mr. Calloway, please return to your seat," the flight attendant said, her voice tight. "We need to prepare for the inspection. Everyone needs to remain seated." Peter's jaw clenched. "I was just going to speak to her." The flight attendant's eyes shifted, and for the first time, Peter saw genuine fear in her gaze. "It's not a good idea, sir. Trust me. Just stay seated." Peter's mind raced. Why was everyone suddenly so afraid of Kara? And why had they all been so respectful of her? Something didn't add up. He was no stranger to high-profile passengers. He'd seen them all, from senators to corporate CEOs. But this was different. This was something deeper. And then, without warning, Kara stood up. The suddenness of her movement startled Peter. His heart skipped a beat as she turned to face him, her dark eyes locking onto his. She was no longer the passive passenger sitting calmly in her seat. This was someone different, someone in control. Kara stepped forward, her voice low but commanding. "You've had enough to say, Mr. Calloway," she said, her tone icy. "But now, I think it's time for you to see who you're really dealing with." She reached into her jacket pocket and pulled out a small, sleek black card. The card glinted in the light of the cabin as she held it out for him to see. Peter's breath caught in his throat as he recognized the insignia on the card. It was the emblem of the Galactic Intelligence Agency, the most powerful organization in the universe. The entire cabin went silent. The flight attendants stopped moving, and all eyes turned to Kara. Peter's mouth went dry. You're one of them?" Kara didn't respond immediately. She didn't need to. She let the shock of the moment settle over Peter and the rest of the passengers. Then, her gaze softened, but only slightly. "You were warned, Mr. Calloway. I don't tolerate disrespect." Her voice dropped, carrying a weight that seemed to reverberate throughout the cabin. "Now sit down, and remember who you're dealing with." Peter didn't move for a long moment. His entire body was frozen in place, the magnitude of what was happening sinking in. He wasn't just dealing with a regular passenger or even a high-profile guest. He was face-to-face with one of the most powerful people in the galaxy. And now every ounce of his arrogance and pride seemed insignificant. The realization hit him like a ton of bricks. Kara had all the power, and he had just made the biggest mistake of his life. The atmosphere in the cabin was thick with disbelief. Everyone, from the flight attendants to the other passengers, watched Kara with a new sense of awe and fear. Peter Calloway stood frozen in place, his arrogance shattered like glass. His earlier confidence had evaporated, replaced by a cold sweat that ran down his back. The flight attendants, who had once moved around the cabin with casual grace, now stood at attention, their eyes nervously flicking between Kara and Peter. It was clear that they, too, understood the weight of what had just been revealed. Kara wasn't just a high-ranking official. She was someone whose presence could change the course of the entire flight. Peter, still struggling to come to terms with the shocking revelation, slowly sank back into his seat. He didn't dare speak another word, his pride now a distant memory. His earlier jabs at Kara seemed laughable now, and as he looked around at the other passengers, he could see the judgment in their eyes. But Kara didn't gloat. She didn't need to. She simply turned on her heel and walked toward the front of the cabin, her posture regal and confident. As she passed by, the other passengers instinctively parted, creating a silent path for her to walk through. There was a quiet respect in the air now, one that was hard to ignore. One of the flight attendants, still shaken, approached Peter hesitantly. "Sir," she said in a quiet voice, "we'll be taking a detour for the security check. Please remain seated and fasten your seatbelt. This is standard protocol for VIP passengers like her." Peter blinked in confusion. "A detour? What do you mean? What's going on?" The flight attendant lowered her voice even more. I can't say, but please understand, the situation has changed. We need to keep the peace on this flight. Just stay in your seat, and everything will be fine." Peter's mind was racing. What was she implying? What had just happened? He couldn't shake the image of Kara, standing there with her CIA badge, like something out of a nightmare. A powerful woman, someone who could make him vanish without a trace if she wanted to. Someone who could flip the galaxy upside down with a single command. In the cockpit, the flight crew was busy preparing for the security protocol. Kara's presence had shifted the entire flight plan. As the ship moved deeper into space, the atmosphere grew more tense. Peter could feel his pulse pounding in his ears, and the questions kept coming. Was he truly in danger? Had his entire life just been upended by one woman, who appeared to be both untouchable and terrifying? What had he done to deserve this? Meanwhile, Kara had made her way to the front of the cabin, where the captain and a few senior flight officers were gathered. She didn't knock or ask permission. She simply walked in, and the room fell silent. The captain, a seasoned officer with decades of experience, stood up as soon as she entered. "Agent Kara, we were expecting you. Please take a seat. We've already made the necessary arrangements." Kara nodded, her expression stoic. "Good. I'll need full access to the flight's communications and any security footage you have. I'm going to need this flight to be as smooth as possible, Captain. We can't afford any mistakes." The captain nodded quickly, his face pale. "Of course. Anything you need, Agent. We'll comply fully." Kara's presence was like a cloud over the entire flight, and though she didn't speak loudly, every word carried weight. Peter, still in the main cabin, could feel the shift. He could feel the fear and uncertainty radiating from the flight crew, as if they were all too aware that a mistake in front of Kara could mean disaster. He shifted uncomfortably in his seat, trying to control his breathing. The walls seemed to close in on him. His earlier outburst felt foolish now. He had thought money and power could buy him anything, that he could control anyone. But now, here he was, a small, insignificant speck in the grand scheme of the galaxy, unable to do anything to protect himself from the consequences of his own actions. The lights in the cabin flickered briefly as the ship made its course adjustment. Kara, still at the front, glanced over her shoulder once more at Peter. Her gaze was calm, but there was something undeniably chilling in her eyes. "Mr. Calloway," she said, her voice carrying just enough for him to hear, "I hope you've learned something today." Peter's heart skipped a beat. He swallowed hard, unable to speak. What could he say? There was nothing left to say. His power, his money, his influence. It meant nothing now. Kara's voice softened slightly, but it still carried an air of authority. "You thought you could disrupt the peace here. You thought you could bully someone, make them feel small. But in the end, Mr. Calloway, it's your own pride that will be your undoing, and it will cost you far more than you realize." Peter remained silent, his mind racing. But what could he do now? What could he possibly do to fix this? As the flight continued its journey through the stars, everyone aboard knew one thing for sure: nothing would be the same. And Kara, with her unshakable confidence and hidden power, had made that very clear. The rest of the flight passed in an eerie silence, the passengers all too aware of the presence of someone far beyond their reach. But Peter would never forget the moment Kara had stood up, revealed her true identity, and changed everything in an instant. As the flight continued to cut through the stars, an oppressive silence hung in the air. The passengers, once full of chatter and gossip, now sat still, their eyes nervously darting between Kara and Peter. Kara remained composed, sitting calmly in her seat at the front of the cabin, her aura powerful yet understated. Every now and then, she could glance up at the screens, her fingers tapping lightly on the armrest, as if the entire situation was beneath her attention. Peter, on the other hand, had not spoken a word since Kara revealed her CIA badge. He had been watching her every move, trying to make sense of what had just happened. His arrogance had been crushed, replaced by a heavy sense of dread. He had never expected this. He had thought money and status were enough to get him out of anything, until now. But it wasn't just his pride that hurt. It was the realization that in the world he lived in, there were forces far beyond his control, forces that could render him insignificant in an instant. The flight attendants kept a safe distance from him. They no longer smiled at his jokes or tried to accommodate his demands. Instead, they kept their eyes fixed on their tasks, moving swiftly and quietly. Their behavior was a stark contrast to how they had treated him earlier, when he was the one calling the shots. Kara stood up and moved toward the back of the cabin, where Peter was sitting. As she walked past, the passengers instinctively shifted their eyes to the side, creating an unspoken path for her to follow. It was as if everyone on board had suddenly understood who was truly in charge. Peter's throat tightened when she stopped directly in front of him. He didn't dare look up at her at first, but he could feel the weight of her gaze. Slowly, he lifted his eyes to meet hers, his stomach churning with unease. "You're wondering how this could happen," Kara said, her voice calm but firm. "You think that because you have money, you have power, that your wealth makes you untouchable." Peter opened his mouth to speak, but the words died on his tongue. He couldn't find anything to say. How could he explain away his actions? How could he defend his arrogance when he now understood the real power in the room? Kara continued, her words sharp and deliberate. "Money doesn't make you powerful, Mr. Calloway. It just makes you dangerous. People like you, people who think they can control others, never realize how fragile their hold on power really is. It only takes one person, someone like me, to show you how small you really are." Peter shifted uncomfortably in his seat. His heart raced. But his pride still clung to him like a fading echo. "I was wrong," he finally said, his voice barely above a whisper. I didn't know who you were. I thought I could." "You thought you could make people feel small," Kara interrupted. Her gaze softened for a brief moment, but the authority in her voice remained unchanged. "But let me tell you something, Mr. Calloway. It's people like you who need to understand that power is not about money. Power is about respect. True power comes from making people feel safe, not from intimidating them." The entire cabin was still. Everyone was watching. The message was clear. Kara wasn't just some high-ranking officer. She was someone who stood for something bigger than herself. She had used her authority to restore balance, not for selfish gain, but to remind everyone aboard who held the real power. Peter, now realizing the full weight of his behavior, sank back into his seat. His hands trembled as he fumbled with the edges of his jacket. There was nothing left to say. His money, his influence, none of it mattered now. His arrogance had been exposed for what it was, empty and fragile. Kara turned to leave, her back straight and her expression unreadable. She didn't need to say anything else. The moment had already spoken volumes. As she walked back toward the front of the cabin, Peter was left to reflect on the conversation, his mind racing. The flight was nearing its destination, but for Peter, the journey was far from over. His life had just been altered in ways he couldn't yet understand. As Kara returned to her seat, the flight continued its journey through the stars. The passengers, now more subdued, couldn't help but look at her with newfound respect. She wasn't just another officer. She wasn't just a woman. She was someone who had made a mark on the flight, on everyone in the cabin. Peter remained silent for the rest of the flight, his eyes fixed on the seat ahead of him. He had learned a valuable lesson, the hard way. His pride, his money, his arrogance had meant nothing. It was respect, dignity, and humility that truly commanded power, and Kara had shown him exactly what that meant. By the time the ship touched down on its final destination, the air had shifted. Peter stepped off the craft, his head held low. He didn't look at anyone. He didn't need to. The lesson had been learned. And Kara, as she walked out of the airship, felt the weight of her actions. The power of her influence didn't need to be flaunted. It was understood. As the final doors closed behind her, she allowed herself a brief, quiet smile. The kind of smile that only someone who had achieved true power could wear. The journey, for her, was just beginning.